Hello and welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Ellie Brown, and I'm the founder and principal consultant with Brown Catalyst Consulting. This workshop is called Mindfully Hiring a Consultant, and it is an introduction to the relationship between a nonprofit and a consultant to make it productive and cost effective on both ends. So this is a collaboration between Brown Catalyst Consulting and the Alliance for Nonprofit Impact. The Alliance is introducing a new tool called UpNotch, and it's a mentorship tool which will launch shortly, or by the time you watch this, will have already launched, and it connects nonprofits with consultant mentors, and it's really cool. I think I'm the first member, so check it out. So, what we're talking about today is consultant relationships and specifically how to make them work. So, I've been on both sides of this. I've hired consultants and I've run consultant relationships within a nonprofit, and I am a consultant. So, the source material for this comes from me talking to nonprofits about their pain points and me talking to consultants about their pain points and pulling together all that information and all the suggestions and all of this data. So, what I'm presenting to you is a condensed version of all those conversations. So, we're talking mostly about communication and systems to help this go more smoothly. So, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get going. I would suggest that you get a notebook and write down some stuff because there's going to be a lot to share. Okay, give me a second to pull up my screen. All right, so there's that. And we're going to go to slideshow. And sorry, this never goes 100% smoothly, does it? Okay, so here we are. What I want to talk about is the objectives for this workshop. So there are three sections or modules. So this is about identifying your true needs, clear communication, and navigating challenges with the nonprofit and consultant relationship. I want to emphasize that this is not theoretical, this is practical. So you can directly go from this to a conversation with your board of directors and your leadership and your staff and hire your next consultant. And if you're engaged in a consultant relationship, you may want to go back and look at some of this stuff together. I want you to think about a real consultant relationship that you've experienced, both positive or negative, and bring that with you through this presentation. So before you hire, this is going to be a key to success. The biggest mistake organizations make is hiring before they've diagnosed the real problem. So there's a difference between a symptom and a root problem. The symptom is what you are seeing, and the root problem is what is actually driving it. So we're going to talk about the root causes, the diagnosis. So a root cause diagnosis. We're going to talk about the 5 whys technique, and we're going to talk about some readiness questions. I encourage some honest self-reflection here. This module requires looking inward before looking outward and engaging with a consultant. This is going to set the foundation for all successful client, nonprofit, and consultant relationships moving forward. So let's talk about symptoms versus root causes. Here's an example of a symptom. We need a fundraising consultant. We need a fundraising consultant because our donor retention has dropped 30% and we don't know why. So we need a consultant is the symptom. Our donor retention has dropped 30% and we don't know why is closer to the root cause. So what might the root cause be? We'll get to that shortly. But I want to point out that when organizations hire for symptoms, you're going to get deliverables that don't stick or don't feel like they're solving the problem that you have. So, for example, you hire a grant writer because your fundraising is down and you're just, writing grant after grant after grant after grant and not raising the money, and you're thinking, oh, I've hired a terrible grant writer. The root cause may actually be that you're not spending the time building the relationships with the foundations. So a grant writer can't help you solve that. That's an internal problem. And I hope that's an example that's helpful. So addressing root causes leads to work that the organization can sustain after the consultant leaves. This is the foundation that everything else is built on. Let's talk about the 5 whys. This is a fun exercise to get to the root cause. So you're going to present a clear problem statement, and you're going to ask why up to 5 times and document each answer. So an example might be, our grant applications are getting rejected. Why? Our narratives aren't compelling. Why? Staff don't have time to write well. Why? They haven't received training on how to write grants. Ah, there it is. That's the root cause. The goal isn't always 5. It's stopping when you hit something actionable. This is a tool you can use in staff meetings and should use before you're ever hiring a consultant. It will also help you develop the scope of work, which I am going to get to shortly. So, the essential questions before hiring a consultant. You want to walk through each question deliberately, and not as a checklist, but as a real conversation to have internally between the board, the staff, and the leadership of the nonprofit organization. So here's something really crucial. What does success look like in 6 months? If you can't answer that, you are not ready to hire. You need to backtrack. These questions protect you, the organization, financially and in a relationship with a consultant, and it protects the consultant so that they're prepped to do the best work and to leave you satisfied. The idea here is to not spend your precious budget on relationships with a consultant that aren't going to work because you haven't done the pre-work. The idea is that you set yourself up and the consultant up for success. That is the goal. So again, if you can't answer these questions, it's signaling for you to pause and back up. So let's do a little internal readiness assessment. So capacity is not just the budget, it's staff time doing the relationship communications, implementing the work, all sorts of things that might come up. So you need to evaluate how much staff time can our staff reasonably put into this work. Do they have the capacity to do this? Do they have the capacity to implement the deliverables? It's leadership attention. So if you're doing strategic planning, for example, is the leadership of the organization aligned with the board of directors? Is there an appetite for change? This is a really big one. So sometimes a consultant will do their job and give you deliverables, but let's say the board of directors is not ready for change. They're feeling very comfortable. They maybe don't like the critical lens looked back on the organization or perhaps their roles on the board of directors. Are they ready to make a change? If the answer is no, you might not be ready for a consultant. You may actually need to do some change management work before you get there. So a consultant can be brilliant and give you something that's not going to be used, and nobody wants that. So sometimes, again, it's not the consultant, it's a readiness problem within the organization. And that's not critical. That just means you have a little internal work to do first. So you want to ask yourself, who will implement the work once the consultant is gone? You might ask the consultant to give you some tips about implementation also. If the consultant is helping you with capacity building, that is the idea that they are serving as an extra temporary staff person for you. But the idea is to not use the consultant as a crutch to use them to help you build that capacity and then to have your team implement the work later or to be able to hire more team members later by raising money or whatever it is. I hope that makes sense. So I don't want you to assume that there's buy-in from anyone. You need to explicitly get buy-in. And let me say this again, your buy-in needs to be active and explicit. So you need to hear people say, yes, I am on board. Okay. So the art of clear communication. Now that you know what you need, how do you translate that into a working relationship? So clear expectations and clear communication prevent the majority of consultant problems. Um, it's not talent and it's not the price. It's often just communication. Sometimes there isn't a designated point person to communicate with the consultant, which makes a confusing relationship. Think about that before you start. So, one way to have clear communication is a statement of work. This is not bureaucratic paperwork. It's a shared roadmap of how the relationship is going to proceed and what the expectations are. So the three areas of the scope of work, sometimes written as SOW, is we're going to talk about good versus problematic examples and the expectations alignment meeting. So here are some essential elements of a good scope of work. You want to walk through each of these things. You want to walk through deliverables. You want to walk through timelines, communication protocols, success metrics, roles, the budget, and scope boundaries. All of these things are essential to be in your scope of work. Do not skip any of these. It will lead to frustration and confusion later on, I promise you. So I want to emphasize that vague language in any of these areas is where the trouble can start. The scope of work isn't just for the consultant to know what they're doing. It's for the nonprofit to maintain internal alignment on what the consultant is doing. Who does what, when, who makes decisions, what needs to be done on what timeline, what is the budget, etc. If you can't fill in one of these elements, you need to go back to module 1. So a good versus problematic statement of work. So let's talk about the contrast between these two statements. So improve our fundraising. Too vague, could mean so many different things. How about this instead? Develop a 12-month individual donor cultivation plan with milestones at 30, 60, 90 days. This will include high net worth research or donor research and a landscape analysis of partner organizations and who their individual donors are. That to me is a very clear scope of work and very clear on what the consultant will be working on. So some red flags might be if they're missing deadlines, missing timelines, no success criteria, or a scope that's too broad or too narrow. And talking about scope, success criteria, I also want to make sure that your expectations are reasonable. So let's say you're hiring someone to do this fundraising work and you had the expectation of raising $1 million within 6 months. So maybe that's not a reasonable expectation. And a good consultant will help you talk through what reasonable expectations might be. So again, a good scope of work protects both of you. It's not about distrust in any way. It's about clarity for both parties. If the nonprofit, has resistance to a detailed scope of work, or the consultant expresses resistance to a good scope of work or a clear scope of work, that's a problem. And I don't recommend moving forward together. So your expectations alignment meeting is the first meeting after the contract is signed before any work begins. This covers communication preferences. Are you communicating through email, Slack, telephone, Zoom calls? Are you meeting once a week, biweekly? Who with, who needs to be in the room, in the virtual room or actual room? Who is the primary contact? This is really important. there should be one person in the organization who is the primary connecting point between the consultant and the organization. It gets confusing when that changes or when it's a group of people and there isn't continuity. And then, very importantly, decision-making authority. Who can decide the final decisions on the consultant's work? Who gets to give the check? Is it the board of directors? Is it the executive director? Is it the development director? So this also needs to be clearly outlined in this expectations meeting, and introductions need to be made and very clear conversations need to happen. So this meeting alone prevents a lot of problems and prevents scope creep, which I will talk about shortly. So some of the challenges you might face are transition. So, or the challenges, not the transition, but transitions happen when you're engaged in a work. And sometimes when you've done everything right, challenges still come up. So maybe someone leaves the organization, maybe there's a change in the budget, maybe there's a change you know, what you think you're working on needs to shift because there's a shift in the organization. Any number of things can happen. So this requires a little bit of agility and always clear communication to get through it. So again, the three most common issues that can come up are scope creep, implementation gaps, where the consultant hands you something that you can't actually implement, and misaligned expectations that show up mid-engagement, are hopefully not, but sometimes at the end of the engagement, where the consultant gives you deliverables and there haven't been clear check-ins or clear feedback along the way. So what they hand you isn't aligned with what you thought you wanted because that communication didn't exist. So you both need to have flexibility and communication to make this working relationship go smoothly and to get what you thought you were getting, to feel satisfied with the money you spent, and to have the consultant have a good experience with your organization also. So, scope creep. How do we prevent it and how do we manage it? So, scope creep is when the work keeps expanding beyond what was agreed and without adjusting the timeline or the budget. So, let's say you are hiring a marketing consultant to fix the back end of your website, and all of a sudden, or let's say it's a developer, not a marketing. So you've hired a developer to fix the back end of your website. And all of a sudden, you decide to rebrand and you're expecting the developer to also implement new graphic design elements into your website and maybe design new pages and maybe add on some extra pages. Does this sound familiar? Because it happens a lot. So to prevent this, you need to understand that every addition is going to be a process and not an assumption. So do not assume that the consultant will do that work for you. And the consultant knows that when they start seeing scope creep, they need to say, hey, let's have a conversation. This is not in the original scope of work. Let's talk about this being an additional cost and adding time to our original timeline. This is a two-way conversation that needs to happen. So you need to address it immediately and be transparent about what the impact is on the timeline and the cost, both of you. You can see this on both sides, the consultant doing scope creep and the nonprofit doing the scope creep. So it's okay to say no for both parties. Both parties have the right to say no to anything outside of the initial scope of work. And that's honoring your original agreement. And it's not personal in any way, shape, or form. So I hope that these main ideas help to get some thoughts going about your organization, maybe about your past work with consultants, maybe about future work you're thinking about. So to reiterate, you want to diagnose before you hire a consultant. You want to do that internal work. That's very important. You want to communicate everything clearly in writing and when you have your kickoff meeting verbally. And you need to have a plan for some potential challenges, or some are foreseen and some are not foreseen. But, having clarity within the organization will help navigate some of those bumpy areas a lot. So the Alliance for Nonprofit Impact has a lot of resources to help you, and Upnotch is going to be a great resource to connect you with knowledge from consultants as well. So I want to thank you for attending this, and I want to wish you the best of luck. Please reach out to me anytime. It's Ellie at browncatalyst.consulting.com, and my website is browncatalyst.consulting.com. Thank you so very much, and good luck.